Welcome, everyone. I will take off my mask because it's just impossible without. So is everyone that's supposed to be here on Zoom, your committee members? I'm going to call attendance. So I'm going to introduce, first of all, Nathan Dadep, who is defending his, Nathan, who is defending his PhD today. So thank you all for attending. I'm first going to introduce committee members as a way of checking everyone's here. Steve Gorelick.
Here.
Here, great. Roz Naylor.
Yep, I'm here.
And is Charles Harvey joining us?
Yep, I saw him on here.
Yep, you are here too. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm Rosemary Knight. I'm from the Geophysics Department, and my role here today is to chair this process. I'm now going to pass it over to Alex to introduce. Great.
As advisor, it is my great honor to introduce Nathan. Nathan got his bachelor's in applied physics from Columbia, where after he worked for CA for several years before we were lucky enough to have him come to Stanford. He was the first student to ever work in my group, so it's a bit of a nerve-wracking moment for me as well. In fact, on Nathan's first day here, there was some sort of mix-up with the office assignments and the keys. My office was still so empty that I think when Nathan went to the office he was assigned to, it looked totally empty and totally reasonable for it to be his office. And then a couple hours later, I came back to my office and found a baseball cap in there, which made me very, very confused. Anyway, I just want to say it's been a real joy to have Nathan in the group, not just because of the research that he's about to present, which you can judge for yourself, but also his sort of informal leadership and mentorship of the junior students in the group, which is, basically all the students in the group. So that's been great. I'm not going to really say much more because I don't want to jinx anything, but I will just briefly say Nathan next year for everyone is won the sole AGU Congressional Fellowship that AGU awards every year. So if all goes well today, big if, he'll be off Capitol Hill. But before that, let's do the defense.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Thanks, Alex, for a nice introduction, and Rosemary for chairing this. Yeah, so it's really exciting to be here to see so many familiar, friendly faces in person. It's really, just a privilege to be able to give this talk today. So today I'll be talking about research from my PhD, and I'll first give some background on what tropical peatlands are and why we care about them. And then I'll go over two projects in detail from my dissertation. And then we'll have some time for a summary and questions at the end. So I'd like to start my talk today by bringing you on a research trip that I took during my first year in grad school. So we're starting here in the Y2E2 building at Stanford, and we're traveling across the world to a region in Southeast Asia that has two of the world's largest islands. This is Sumatra here on the left, and Borneo on the right. You might be familiar with these cities, Kuala Lumpur and Singapore, right in the middle. Shout out. And we're actually traveling to this field site that's along the Brunei-Malaysia border. And here, as we're approaching, this is the road that I would take to the field site to install some sensors. All right, so finally, we've arrived at our destination. And as we enter this forest, we're entering one of the last remaining undisturbed peatlands in Southeast Asia. Pause for a second. Try and move this thing, because that's going to block all my titles.
It's a down arrow beside the green bar.
What's that?
Beside the green bar. Your screen sharing?
No, he just wants to move that bar out of it. Oh.
You can actually do it more.
Yeah. More? Oh,
there. You're stuck like that forever now.
Okay.
Now it's probably hiding what you're trying to.
Yeah. Okay, now I'm good. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, so we're entering this peat swamp forest. And so if you're not familiar with peatlands, they're one of the world's most unique and most important ecosystems. So as you can see in this photo, they're these swamp-like regions, and they're very wet. And in fact, in pristine peatlands, they're not only wet, but they're actually completely flooded for most of the year. So here, when you see water on the ground, these aren't just puddles. This is actually the groundwater table, which is at the ground surface. So what this means is that there's no air that reaches the soil below under these natural conditions, and so that creates a low oxygen environment that makes it such that bacteria can't really thrive. And so the decomposition rates are really slowed down. So we get are these soils that are made up entirely of organic material. And what I mean by organic material is that when vegetation dies and it falls to the ground, it never fully decomposes. And so this soil is made up mainly of dead plant matter. And so here it accumulates at least slower than it decomposes. So what this makes peatlands is this really important carbon sink. This means that they store carbon in the soil and prevent it from circulating back into the atmosphere where it would otherwise contribute to planetary warming. And for context, global peatlands store double the carbon that's in the vegetation biomass in the world's forests. So it's really large amounts of carbon that we're talking about here. The thing is that we can't really take this carbon sink for granted. When peatland hydrology is disturbed, the soil can start to dry out. It can decompose, can also catch fire, and then the carbon would then be emitted to the atmosphere. So in our study region here in Southeast Asia, it contains the largest stores of peat in the tropics. But unfortunately, these are also the most degraded peatlands in the world. So here's what degradation looks like. These are natural peat swamp forests. They've been logged. Then drainage canals are built initially to get timber out of the forests, and then they have this secondary effect that they lower the water table, then more heavy machinery can be brought in to build roads. And so this allows for development and conversion of peatlands for agricultural use. So here's this picture of an oil palm plantation. This is the most common crop in peatlands. Another one is acacia, which is used to produce paper. So here's a visualization of forest cover over time in Borneo. You can see that the deforestation has really accelerated in the past 4 decades. This is actually showing the forest cover for all of Borneo, not only peatlands, but in fact, peatlands have gotten it worse. So everywhere on this map that you see a color, this is where peat soils have been identified. There are a lot of colors on this map, I know, but the key takeaway here is that most of the area, 90%, is either been either a deforested area or it's been converted for agricultural use. So there's actually very little primary forest that remains in this region. So the impacts of degradation from a carbon perspective are quite enormous. The estimates of emissions from increased decomposition are around 150 megatons of carbon per year. For context, that's equivalent to 120 million cars on the road. So fires also can occur when peatlands are degraded. They release large amounts of carbon all in these one-time events. And in 1997, that was the worst year on record, and it was estimated that fires from that year released between 13 and 40% of global fossil fuel emissions. So making things worse is the fact that smoke from peat fires is pretty deadly. because the soil is still wet when these fires are burning. They usually are smoldering underground for longer periods of time at lower temperatures. This creates incomplete combustion that results in the release of really thick smoke. And quite a shocking and sobering statistic is that the fires in 2015 were estimated to have caused over 100,000 deaths in the region. All right, so it's been shown that the year-to-year differences in fire severity are related to climate variability, basically how much rain peatlands are getting each year. So in this figure by field, we can compare the rainfall here on the bottom, and on the top that's visibility, which is a measure of basically fire severity. And what we see is that these biggest spikes in smoke occur only when the worst drought years are occurring. So if we zoom out to the entire record back to the 1960, what we see is that these severe fires didn't really start occurring until the 1980s, which happens to coincide with the really large changes in land use. And so we can infer that fires are caused by really a combination of both climate drought, and degradation. So what ties these impacts together from degradation to fires and carbon emissions is hydrology, basically how wet the peatland is. So for example, when drainage canals are built, I mentioned before that this lowers the water table, which in turn dries out the peat soils, and the drier peat can burn, can also decompose. And so if we want to understand and estimate regional scale impacts of degradation, then we need regional scale hydrologic measurements. So unfortunately, there's just not much hydrologic data that's available in this region, something that we might take for granted in other parts of the world. So for example, there's this large data set of soil moisture measurements from the International Soil Moisture Network. You can see that most of the sites are in North America, in the US, Europe, and parts of Asia, but really there are no sites in Southeast Asian peatlands. So I could go out into the field, start my own site, add to the network, but as many of you know, field work can be difficult. In my case, it took over 2 days just to get out to Brunei, and then once I was in the field, I had to make sure that our equipment wouldn't be disturbed by people who were wandering in the forest. So I put up this fake sign that it posed a danger to people. So there are also reports of wild boars that are getting into the sensors. And another difficulty in peatlands is that if you step in the wrong place, suddenly you find yourself knee deep in the peat. And I made the mistake of walking out into the peatland with flip-flops, but I didn't walk out with both of them. So the last point I want to make here is that this is a really huge area that I'm trying to study. These peatlands cover an area about the size of the state of Florida. And so this question remains, how are we supposed to go about obtaining regional scale hydrologic data in tropical peatlands? So this is where remote sensing comes in. Satellite sensors can image an entire region at once, and satellites have previously been used in this region to measure fires, land use change in peatlands, but basically no one had used these sensors to study hydrologic variables. And I'll explain why a little bit more on that later on in the presentation, but just want to summarize that the main contribution of my work during my PhD has been to develop methods to quantify hydrologic change and to show what their implications are for peatlands. Okay, so hopefully that background gives you a sense of the issues that are facing peatlands, why they're important, and why hydrology plays such an important role here. And so I'll now start describing 2 projects where I've developed data sets for hydrologic variables. The first one is drainage canals, which is the most direct way in which degradation can alter the peatland hydrology. The other variable that I've measured is soil moisture, which is a direct measurement of peatland wetness. So now I'll describe how I went about creating these data sets and what they tell us about carbon emissions and fire risk. All right, so we know from studies at individual sites that drainage can increase carbon losses from decomposition. So there have been a number of studies that have compared carbon emissions in drained versus non-drained sites. In this plot by Deschmuke, we can see that there are drained sites in red, non-drained sites in black. Right away, we can see on the y-axis that carbon emissions are much higher in the drained site than in the non-drained site. You can also see that the water table shown on the x-axis generally hovers around the ground surface for the non-drained peatland, but is deeper in this drained peatland. And these kinds of studies have really important implications, because basically, if we want to estimate carbon emissions at regional scales, then ideally we would take these relationships and scale them up with hydrologic data to estimate emissions. The problem is that we don't really have regional hydrologic data either for drainage or for water table depth. And since there's no hydrologic data, a number of studies have instead modeled carbon emissions as a function of land use type, which is not a hydrologic variable. So here's a table that's an example of the IPCC who are making this approximation of emissions factor that's based solely on land use classes. So they're making this assumption that land use can be used as a proxy for drainage and for hydrologic status. But we don't really know if this assumption holds true or not, because we don't, at least until this project, we didn't have drainage data to compare it to it. So there was this clear need for figuring out where drainage canals are. So we had these following research questions in this project. First, we wanted to identify where is drainage happening. Next, we wanted to test if the assumption that drainage varies with land use, whether that's actually valid. And then lastly, we wanted to see if drainage and carbon emissions are related not just at individual sites, but also at regional scales. So as you might have guessed, I looked to use satellite images to identify where there are drainage canals. And the first thing to note is that canals can be about 1 to 20 meters wide. And so to actually see them from space, we need high resolution imagery. So right now, the most widely available images from NASA and from the European Space Agency satellites is about 10 to 30 meter resolution. And so that's not really going to cut it for identifying canals, but thankfully in the past few years, there have been a number of private imaging companies that have popped up with data at about 5 meter resolution. And so we were able to use data from this partnership with Planet Labs and Stanford. So another potential issue when you're trying to image a region from space is that clouds or smoke can cover the ground surface. That's pretty common here in Southeast Asia. You can see Borneo and Sumatra there are completely covered by smoke. But these new data sets, they have daily resolution, temporal resolution, and with so many images, you're bound to get images out of most locations that are cloud-free at some point in time. And so if you stitch these together, then you can create a mosaic of cloud-free imagery. All right, so this is what this image looks like. As you can see here, these canals and roads are visible by eye. And so I know that they're canals and roads because they're these linear features. They're generally in a network and they're connected to each other. And so we can label these by hand. I considered doing this over the entire region, but then my wrist started hurting and I realized it would take too long because peatlands span an area that's about 10,000 times this image. And so instead I trained a computer to identify canals. And so I first needed to get data to use to train the model. We don't, as I said before, we don't have drainage canal data kind of a priori. And so I enlisted the help of my wife, Emily, sitting right here. You can applaud if you want. She spent more than a couple hours helping me to label this area that we see here for canals. So I also want to mention my collaborators who are computer vision experts from Switzerland, Dora Mateusz and Pascal. And they helped develop a canal identification algorithm. So our algorithm relied on machine learning. We used this model commonly used in computer vision for called a convolutional neural network. So I don't really have the time to go into that in detail, but basically our collaborators had been using this for a similar task, which was to map roads from satellite images. As you can imagine, roads and canals present a similar classification problem for a computer to identify. So here you can see how the model performs. So on the left, we have our labeled canals, and on the right is what the model found. So you can see that they're not exactly perfectly aligned, but for the most part, there's a pretty good general agreement. Let's take a look at that. All right, so we applied this model throughout the whole region, and in so doing, we got the first drainage canal map in Southeast Asian peatlands. And yeah, if you want to applaud now, it would be an appropriate time. So here we zoomed into some areas as an example. If you recall, when we were looking at those images of the Brunei-Malaysia border, we saw that there were plantations on the left and forests on the right. And so we can see that that's captured here in this map. And we sort of expect it because we know that Brunei's peatlands were protected by a regulation back in the 1980s. Another cool thing to note is that here there is a river that's next to the road, but then the model didn't misidentify that. And so, this gives us some confidence that our maps were actually working, or that our model was working in creating these maps. So, for some scientific questions, we don't always need the exact locations of canals, but we're interested in how many canals are in a given area to sort of get a general idea of sort of drainage impacts. And so we calculated this number, drainage density, which is just the length of canals per 1 square kilometer. Our model identified drainage canals in about 65% of the region, and so clearly, drainage is widespread, and I know Ophelia is not happy about that. Good thing she left, because I was going to say this is actually probably a conservative estimate. We have 5-meter resolution images, and we're probably not capturing all of the canals that also might exist in the region. And so yeah, that was answered our first research question. Our second research question here was about testing the assumption that drainage varies directly with land use. So we got the drainage map and the land use map, and we compared them. And what we find is that there is some correlation. For example, here, so if you see the pristine forests, they basically had no drainage that was identified there. Industrial plantations on this bottom row have nearly all of the high drainage density areas. But we also can note from this figure that there's still quite a big range of drainage densities within each land use class. And so, for example, smallholder plantations and industrial plantations, they have all 4 categories of drainage densities. And so this is suggested to us that even though land use classifications are perhaps a good first estimate of drainage impact, they don't capture the diversity in hydrologic impacts from drainage canals. Yeah, so lastly, we wanted to see if drainage is a predictor of carbon emissions at large scales. We know this is true at individual sites, the question was, does this still hold when we're looking at much larger scales? And so to make this comparison, we don't actually have regional measurements of CO2 emissions, but we have a proxy, an estimate through subsidence. So one of my collaborators, Alison Hoyt, she recently measured subsidence in this groundbreaking study a few years ago. And so if you're not familiar, subsidence means that it's a measure of the change in the ground surface. So this happens when the mass of carbon that's in the peat is lost to the atmosphere through decomposition. And so we can use subsidence as a proxy for carbon emissions here. So when we compared subsidence in our drainage categories, this is the distribution that we're showing here, and the medians for each drainage category, we see that there were generally higher carbon emissions when there was more drainage canals. All right, so to summarize this first project, we created the first map of drainage canals in Southeast Asian peatlands. We found that drainage is widespread, and we found that drainage density, while it does appear to be related to land use, is not, that the broad land use classes aren't perfectly capturing this range of hydrologic disturbance. Lastly, we found that there is a relationship between drainage density and subsidence, and by extension, carbon flux at large scales. So if you want to read more, this is published in AGU Advances last year. All right, so in project one, I've mapped drainage canals, which is this important variable. It captures hydrologic disturbance in peatlands. We also know that this is an imperfect data set. We don't have high enough resolution imagery to capture all the canals. We also don't know how deep the canals are or how well they're being maintained. So we realized it would be helpful to measure the hydrologic state of the peatland, in other words, the wetness, directly. And so that's where soil moisture, the variable soil moisture, comes in. So previously there had been a number of studies that had linked fires to precipitation. So in this plot by field, we can see that when the precipitation over the prior 4 months is much lower, then we see this nonlinear increase in the fires per day. So precipitation alone is a pretty good predictor of fire. We see that there's a high correlation. But the problem is that mechanistically we know that it's not taking into account the conditions on the ground, because precipitation is only an input to the system. It doesn't have, can't take into account drainage. And so our thought here was, well, if we can measure soil moisture with satellites, can that improve fire prediction? So we had the following research questions. First, can we actually measure soil moisture accurately in peatlands using remote sensing? This is something that sort of hadn't been done before and was assumed not to be possible. If we can do it, does it actually relate to fire? Does it show some signal? And what are its implications? All right, so thankfully to measure soil moisture, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. Soil moisture has been measured in agricultural settings over the past few decades using microwave sensors. And so what you see here is this picture of a sensor called a radiometer. You can attach it to a tower, and when you point it at the ground, it can measure the gray body radiation that's coming from the soil, and this amount of radiation that it sees at microwave frequencies is really sensitive to the amount of water in the ground. So some smart people at NASA decided to put this instrument on a satellite to measure soil moisture globally. So the problem is that until now, the remote sensing community hadn't really trusted data in the tropics, and that's because thick vegetation can block the soil moisture signal from reaching the satellite, and it can lower its accuracy. So when I proposed these results at a conference, I was actually heckled. Someone yelled, "How could this be? It's basic physics." But there are two main factors that made us think that these assumptions no longer hold in this region. So first, NASA launched a new satellite in 2015 called the Soil Moisture Active Passive Satellite, also known as SMAP. So this satellite measures lower frequencies compared to previous satellite missions, and we know that lower frequency can better penetrate the vegetation canopy. We also know from that land use map that deforestation is really widespread in this region. And so together, these factors suggested that soil moisture measurement might be possible in this region. So to assess this, I measured how much of the soil moisture signal can actually pass through the vegetation. This is a quantity that's known as vegetation transmissivity. And in this cumulative distribution plot, the distribution of the transmissivity values that we measured are shown here. And this vertical line here is basically a threshold value for accurate soil moisture measurement. And what we see is that in peatlands, about 85% of the area is to the right of this threshold, which means that it's sensitive to soil moisture, and so we expect that it can measure it accurately. Surprisingly is that it's better in peatlands than in non-peatlands, where about 50% of non-peatlands in this region had sort of really dense vegetation, such that we wouldn't expect to be able to measure the soil moisture in those areas. So in a separate analysis, I also estimated the error of the data set. Since we don't have in situ samples to compare to, I had to modify a statistical technique to estimate the error. And I don't really have time to get into it, but basically that analysis found that the accuracy of our data set is probably close to the global error targets for SMAP. And so essentially we're finding that we can measure soil moisture to the same accuracy level as in other parts of the world. And so these two analyses together also suggested that soil moisture measurement is possible in most of the region's peatlands. All right, so what does this data actually look like? Here's a year of measurement at 1 pixel. We can observe soil moisture dynamics over time. You can see that the lowest values were around September, which happens to coincide with the peak of the dry season. Here, I've plotted the time series for soil moisture at 10 different pixels over a longer 2-year period, and we can see that the seasonal cycle is still evident. 2015 looks a little bit drier, and that makes sense because since it was a severe drought year because of the El Nino. In this plot, I also colored the time series by burned area, which is taken from the Global Fire Emissions Database, another remote sensing product. What you can see is that generally when soil moistures were lower, there was generally more burned area. So when we aggregate this relationship across all pixels, we find that there is this inverse relationship, similar sort of to the field plot with precipitation, but this time with soil moisture on the x-axis and fractional burned area on the y-axis. So when we get to drier soils, we have more fire. So even when we're measuring soil moisture ahead of time, so this is a 30-day lead time, we still see this similar relationship. And what's exciting about this is it means that we can potentially use this information to identify areas that are vulnerable to fire a month in advance. So in trying to validate these results, I was looking through the literature and I came across this laboratory study of peat ignition. And so this was a study done by Franson and others just Franson, never mind. And what he was trying to do was ignite peat samples at different levels of moisture. And what he found is that there's this relationship where we similarly get at drier soil moistures, we have this much higher increase in the probability of the ignition. And so this was a really exciting result to see how well it actually matched with our data, because it allows us to infer that peat susceptibility to fire is really governed by soil moisture, even at these large scales, small scales, it's sort of scale independent. All right, so the main takeaways here are that soil moisture can be measured by SMAP in Southeast Asian peatlands. And the implication of this is that soil moisture can be used to predict burned area. All right, so I said I'd only talk about 2 projects, but now that we're on the topic of measuring soil moisture, I just want to briefly share some data from this additional project where I modeled future changes in soil moisture. So if you recall, I said at the beginning of the talk that both degradation and climate play this important role in determining fire risk. And so far, I've mainly looked at, or I've mainly discussed degradation impacts from drainage canals. But a big question remaining is whether climate change might also affect future fire regimes. And so here I'm showing some predictions from high resolution climate models. What we see is that in the near future, this is the 2040 to 2050 time range compared to today, is that rain is expected to decrease. You can see that since most of the plot is red here. Evaporative demand is also expected to increase due to higher temperatures. So what we did is we took this SMAP soil moisture record from 2015 to 2021, and we used this to create a model of soil moisture as a function of climate and peatland disturbance. What we found is that generally these changing climate results in drier soil moistures. Here is the distribution across space of the mean dry season soil moisture, and then here you can see the change. The average change is somewhere around 0.02, 0.03. You know, it's hard to contextualize this, but when we look at the magnitude of this change and we compare it to severe fire years during the last couple of years, it's about 50% of the magnitude, which is a pretty big shift if we're talking about an average year in terms of mean soil moisture. And so this has really important implications for future fire risk. All right, so to summarize, we've talked about how peatlands are this important global carbon sink. This is a carbon sink that's vulnerable to drainage canals, and so it was important that we had a way to quantify these drainage impacts. We found that it's more drainage is related to carbon emissions at these large scales. We also wanted to measure the wetness of peatlands directly, and to do that, we used the SMAP satellite. We showed that it's valid in this region, and we developed essentially this first data set of soil moisture. So we do see that soil moisture is this important predictor of fire at scales both large and small. And so lastly, with this long record of soil moisture, we can begin to model it in the future under climate change. So our model predicts that soils will be drier, and this could represent a significant shift for future fire risk. So I'd like to end on a slightly more positive note. You know, although tropical peatlands are certainly at risk, we do have this important opportunity to rehabilitate peatlands through canal blocking and re-wetting. It's been identified sort of in the international community as one of the more cost-effective ways to meet greenhouse gas targets. And so Indonesia has also pledged to re-wet a significant fraction of their peatlands. And so a follow-up project that I may spend some time on the next few months is on optimizing re-wetting strategies. With new remote sensing data sets and this sort of renewed international focus on the region, you know, perhaps there is some hope that we can restore tropical peatlands. All right, so before we do questions, I'd like to first acknowledge some people who've been instrumental in my getting through these past couple of years. First, I want to thank Alex, my advisor. I couldn't have asked for a better advisor. You've been an amazing teacher. You've been so supportive and caring, and you've created a great group, and you helped us navigate this pandemic. So thank you. I really appreciate everything you've done for me and for the group. I also feel really blessed to have been part of such a collegial group that we can talk about science with, and it's really been a pleasure to work with you all. So thank you. I have to also give a special shout out to my peatland gurus. These are Allison and Alex and Charlie, who've been essentially my co-authors for all of my projects. I'd like to acknowledge my very supportive committee, Steve, Roz, and Rosemary. Thank you for sharing this session. These are here were two folks who saved me basically in the peatlands. This is Haji Bohari and Pudek. They really know their way around a peatland. So I'd also like to acknowledge some funding that I've received from NASA and from the School of Earth and from the Department of Earth System Science. They've all supported my research. And AJU, who awarded me a fellowship for next year. There's really so many people that when I was trying to come up with these acknowledgements that I really didn't want to leave out, and I could thank so many people, but I've just tried to list some of these groups that these different people are with. I owe so much to them for their help in my professional and personal development. So the Stanford community has really been just a wonderful place to be. People always ask me what it's like here. And from my personal experience, I always say, well, surprisingly, no one has any ego. It's really this place where people I've found to be very supportive of each other, both students and faculty. I don't think this is always the case in academic environments. And so I really want to thank you all for being a part of this and for becoming my lifelong friends. So I also have to thank my family. These are my parents here, and there's my sister, and some extended family. Thank you for always believing in me and for always reminding me of my values. Look at the camera now to make these points. And my last thanks, and perhaps my biggest thanks, is to my wife, Emily. You've been the most patient, supportive, and loving partner that I could ask for. And so thank you so much for bearing with the last couple of years. And Ophelia, you've been my joy and inspiration if you're watching the recording in the future. So thank you so much. All right, and with that, I'll take some questions.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. So now time for questions from the audience. The committee will hold their questions till later. I'll let
Caroline?
Yeah, fantastic job.
Thank you.
I have two questions about project one. So first, I'm curious of how you actually differentiate the canals from the roads, or if you do, like, because maybe road density is just correlated with drainage density. So I'm curious about that. But then the second question was about if you could just expand a little on the subsidence estimates and kind of how those are sensed and just give a little more detail on how those estimates.
Right, thanks. Yeah, thanks. To answer your first question, so you said, how do we differentiate between canals and roads here? So yeah, you can see that these are roads and these are canals. It's hard to really tell. They're both these linear features. So in this case, we didn't make a distinction. We said we're mapping both canals and roads. And the assumption here is that essentially anywhere that there's a road, it has to be accompanied by drainage. And so even if it's not quote unquote a drainage canal, it still has the same impact in that the area is losing water due to this drainage. And so your second question was about subsidence. So yeah, these subsidence measurements were made by interferometric synthetic aperture radar. Essentially, what the radar is measuring is changes in phase of the signal that are getting back to a satellite. I'm definitely not an expert on this, but what it can do is it can measure millimeter changes in the ground surface over time. And so that's how, yeah, you just can take images at different times, 2 different times, and then you can see how much it's changed between those. Thanks. Eric?
Just on subsidence real quick. Like in the Central Valley, like I know that there's a lot of subsidence too here in California, and my understanding is that's because of the lowering water table. Is that also the case here? Is the water, does the drainage have anything to do with it, or is it purely because of carbon loss?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, there are assumptions about sort of how much of the subsidence is due to carbon loss versus compaction versus just the peat can also shrink when it dries out. That's all been sort of accounted for when we make a transition to making an actual carbon estimate, but here we're just showing with subsidence, so we don't actually have to come up with exact numbers, but sort of the carbon emissions, sort of using it as a proxy here, we can just make that estimate. So, thanks.
I have a question on the second project that you showed. The soil moisture is a pretty good predictor of the burn fire area. And also remember at the beginning, you showed the precipitation is also showing similar relationship. I was wondering how much better soil moisture predicts the area. I think this, I'm asking this because I think projections of precipitation is already very poor, and I think precipitation is an input to soil moisture. So I was wondering how strong that.
Right. Yeah. So that was yes. The question, in case you couldn't hear it. Actually, no. I assume that people can hear it, right? Online.
Can these guys hear?
Yeah. I think. Yeah. I guess I'll just repeat it. Is that how much does information essentially does soil moisture provide on top of precipitation? So this was something that we tested directly, actually. So what we did was we created these 2 simple models for burned area, sort of as we use this type of model, and then we fit it to both precipitation, we fit it to soil moisture, and then we use this model where we had both precipitation and soil moisture together. And what we did was we compared how well those models could predict the burned area. So, what we found is that this model that has both soil moisture and precipitation has an improved predictive skill over precipitation alone, which suggests that soil moisture is adding this additional information to our ability to predict fires. Are there any questions online? People can put it in the chat if they want.
Oh, I see.
They can just, I don't know if people can unmute themselves. Okay, oh, thanks. Awesome.
So any questions online? Otherwise, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Nathan. Let me introduce myself. My name is Mark Costa. I'm one of Nathan's former teachers. Nathan, well done. I'm very proud of you, as you know. I still have my doubts about remote sensing and its application in this, but that's a topic for a different time. I'd like to point out one thing to you, Nathan. Slide 16, I think as your former teacher, that when you identified human health issues associated with the decomposition and burning of peat, crises, ES, not IS, plural as opposed to singular. You can laugh about that. That is going to be my contribution to your presentation today. Thank you very much. And again, I am incredibly proud of your work, and thank you for the invite. I enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks, Mr. Costa. He's my 7th grade teacher,
Oh,
science
gosh.
teacher, and also baseball coach, 2 years.
7th grade and he's still tracking your progress. That's impressive.
He's committed, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Crises, we'll see. I'm gonna check the dictionary later.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yep.
If I just ask one more question about like the impacts here. So I was curious about if you could elaborate like on if the area does re-wet the area, like how does that affect the economy that they've built with these farms, these plantations? Is that going to have an effect on the local folks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm certainly not an agricultural or economic expert, but I would think that you know, they usually have to get the water tables down to about half a meter deep to be able to plant these trees, and so you know, I don't know really if it's feasible to re-wet an area and also keep it for agricultural use. But you know, about a third of the area is just sort of deforested and kind of open and not being used. So that already, I think, makes a big area that we can potentially re-wet without changing the economic situation there. You know, about a third of the plantations are on an industrial scale. We have just, you look at the satellite image, there's just so many square kilometers of palm oil trees. But then also another third is the smallholder farms. Those are sort of individual or smaller scale farms that people are trying to cultivate these crops. And so, you know, I think that there could also be a difference there in terms of who is impacted and how well they might be able to respond to sort of efforts to restore this area.
Great. Well, thanks to Nathan again, and thanks to all of you for